Chapter 3. Make-Believe. Although Momo listened to grown-ups and children with equal sympathy and attention, the children had a special reason for enjoying their visits to the amphitheater as much as they did. Now that she was living there, they found they could play better games than ever before. They were never bored for an instant, but not because she contributed a lot of ingenious suggestions. Momo was there and joined in, that was all, but for some reason her mere presence put bright ideas into their heads. They invented new games every day, and each was an improvement on the last. One hot and sultry afternoon, a dozen or so children were sitting around on the stone steps, waiting for Momo, who had gone for a stroll nearby, as she sometimes did. From the look of the sky, which was filled with fat black clouds, there would soon be a thunderstorm. "I'm going home," said one girl who had a little sister with her. "Thunder and lightning scares me." "What about when you're at home?" asked a boy in glasses. "Doesn't it scare you there?" "Of course it does," she said. "Then you may as well stay," said the boy. The girl shrugged her shoulders and nodded. After a while she said, "But maybe Momo won't turn up." "So what?" another voice broke in. It belonged to a rather ragged and neglected-looking boy. "Even if she doesn't, we can still play a game." "All right, but what?" "I don't know, something or other." "Something or other's no good. Anyone got an idea?" "I know," said a fat boy with a high-pitched voice. "Let's pretend the amphitheater's a ship, and we sail off across uncharted seas and have adventures. I'll be the captain, you can be first mate, and you can be a professor, a scientist, because it's a scientific expedition. The rest of you can be sailors." "What about us girls?" came a plaintive chorus. "What'll we be?" "Girl sailors! It's a ship of the future." The fat boy's idea sounded promising. They tried it out, but everyone started squabbling and the game never got underway. Before long they were all sitting around on the steps again, waiting. Then Momo turned up and everything changed. The Argo's bow rose and fell as she swiftly but steadily steamed through the swell towards the South Coral Sea. No ship in living memory had ever dared to sail these perilous waters, which abounded with shoals, reefs, and mysterious sea monsters. Most deadly of all was the so-called traveling tornado, a waterspout that forever roamed this sea like some cunning beast of prey. The waterspout's route was quite unpredictable, and any ship caught up in its mighty embrace was promptly reduced to matchwood. Being a research vessel, of course, the Argo had been specially designed to tackle the traveling tornado. Her hull was entirely constructed of adamantium, a steel as tough and flexible as a sword blade, and had been cast in one piece by a special process that dispensed with rivets and welded seams. For all that, few captains and crews would have had the courage to face such incredible hazards. Captain Gordon of the Argo had that courage. He gazed down proudly from the bridge at the men and women of his crew, all of whom were experts in their particular field. Beside him stood his first mate, Jim Ironside, an old salt who had already survived 127 hurricanes. Stationed on the sun deck further aft were Professor Eisenstein, the expedition's senior scientist, and his assistants, Moira and Sarah, who had as much information stored in their prodigious memories as a whole reference library. All three were hunched over their precision instruments, quietly conferring in complicated scientific jargon. Seated cross-legged, a little apart from them, was Momo-san, a beautiful native girl. Now and again the professor would consult her about some special characteristic of the South Coral Sea, and she would reply in her melodious Hula dialect, which he alone could understand. The purpose of the expedition was to discover what caused the traveling tornado and, if possible, make the sea safe for other ships by putting an end to it. So far, however, there had been no sign of the tornado, and all was quiet. Quite suddenly, the captain's thoughts were interrupted by a shout from the lookout in the crow's nest. "Captain!" he called down, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Unless I'm crazy, there's a glass island dead ahead of us." The captain and Jim Ironside promptly leveled their telescopes. Professor Eisenstein and his two assistants hurried up, bursting with curiosity, but the beautiful native girl calmly remained seated. The peculiar customs of her tribe forbade her to seem inquisitive. When they reached the glass island, as they very soon did, the professor scrambled down a rope ladder and gingerly stepped ashore. The surface was not only transparent, but so slippery that he found it hard to keep his footing. The island was circular and about 50 feet across, with a sort of dome in the center. On reaching the summit, the professor could distinctly make out a light, flashing deep in the heart of the island. He passed this information to the others, who were eagerly lining the ship's rail. "From what you say," said Moira, "it must be a Blancmangius viscosus." "Perhaps," Sarah chimed in, "though it could equally be a Jellybeania multicolorata." Professor Eisenstein straightened up and adjusted his glasses. "In my opinion," he said, "we're dealing with a variety of the common Chocolatus indigestibilis, but we can't be sure till we've examined it from below." The words were scarcely out of his mouth when 3 girl sailors, all of whom were world-famous scuba divers and had already pulled on their wetsuits, plunged over the side and vanished into the blue depths. Nothing could be seen for a while but air bubbles. Then one of the girls, Sandra, shot to the surface. "It's a giant jellyfish!" she gasped. "The other 2 are caught up in its tentacles and can't break loose. We must save them before it's too late." So saying, she disappeared again. Without hesitation, 100 frogmen, led by Commander Franco, nicknamed the Dolphin because of his skill and experience, dived into the sea. A tremendous battle raged beneath the surface, which soon became covered with foam. But the gigantic creature's strength was such that not even 100 brave men could release the girls from its terrible embrace. The professor turned to his assistants with a puzzled frown. "Something in these waters seems conducive to the growth of abnormally large sea creatures," he observed. "What an interesting phenomenon." Meanwhile, Captain Gordon and his first mate had come to a decision. "Back!" shouted Jim Ironside. "All hands back on board! We'll have to slice the monster in half. It's the girl's only hope." Dolphin, Franco, and his frogmen climbed back on board. After going astern for a short distance, the Argo headed straight for the jellyfish at maximum speed. The steel ship's bow was as sharp as a razor. Without a sound, almost without a jolt, it sliced the huge creature in half. Although this maneuver was fraught with danger for the girls entangled in its tentacles, Jim Ironside had gauged his course to within a hair's breadth and steered right between them. Instantly the tentacles on each half of the jellyfish went limp and lifeless, and the trapped girls managed to extricate themselves. They were welcomed back on board with joy. Professor Eisenstein hurried over to them. "It was all my fault," he said. "I should never have sent you down there. Forgive me for risking your lives like that." "There's nothing to forgive, Professor," one of the girls replied with a carefree laugh. "It's what we came for, after all." "Danger's our trade," the other girl put in. But there was no time to say more. Because of the rescue operation, the captain and his crew had completely forgotten to keep watch on the sea. Only now, in the nick of time, did they become aware that the traveling tornado had appeared on the horizon and was racing toward them. An immense roller tossed the Argo into the air, hurled her on her side, and sent her plummeting into a watery abyss. Any crew less courageous and experienced than the Argos would have been washed overboard or paralyzed with fear by this very first onslaught. But Captain Gordon stood foursquare on his bridge as though nothing had happened, and his sailors were just as unperturbed. Momo-san, the beautiful native girl, being unaccustomed to such storm-tossed seas, was the only person to take refuge in a lifeboat. The whole sky turned pitch black within seconds. Shrieking and roaring, the tornado flung itself at the Argo, alternately catapulting her sky-high and sucking her down into cavernous troughs. Its fury seemed to grow with every passing minute as it strove in vain to crush the ship's steel hull. The captain calmly gave orders to the first mate, who passed them on to the crew in a stentorian voice. Everyone remained at his or her post. Professor Eisenstein and his assistants, far from abandoning their scientific instruments, used them to estimate where the eye of the storm must be, for that was the course to steer. Captain Gordon secretly marveled at the composure of these scientists, who were not, after all, as closely acquainted with the sea as himself and his crew. A shaft of lightning zigzagged down and struck the ship's hull, electrifying it from stem to stern. Sparks flew whenever the crew touched anything, but none of them worried. Everyone on board had spent months training hard for just such an emergency. The only trouble was, the thinner parts of the ship, cables and stanchions, for instance, began to glow like the filament in an electric light bulb, and this made the crews work harder, despite the rubber gloves they were wearing. Fortunately, the glow was soon extinguished by a downpour heavier than anyone on board, with the exception of Jim Ironside, had ever experienced. There was no room for any air between the raindrops. They were too close together, so they all had to put on masks and breathing apparatus. Flashes of lightning and peals of thunder followed one another in quick succession. The wind howled, and mast-high breakers deluged everything with foam. With all engines running full ahead, the Argo inched her way forward against the elemental might of the storm. Down below in the boiler room, engineers and stokers made superhuman efforts. They had lashed themselves in place with stout ropes so that the ship's violent pitching and tossing would not hurl them into the open furnaces. But when, at long last, the Argo and her crew reached the innermost eye of the storm, what a sight confronted them! Gyrating on the surface of the sea, which had been ironed flat as a pancake by the sheer force of the storm, was a huge figure. Seemingly poised on one leg, it grew wider the higher one looked, like a mountainous humming top, rotating too fast for the eye to make it out in any detail. "A teetotum elasticum!" the professor exclaimed gleefully, holding on to his glasses to prevent them from being washed off his nose by the rain. "Maybe you'd care to translate that?" growled Jim Ironside. "We're only simple seafaring folk, and—" "Don't bother the professor now," Sarah broke in, "or you'll ruin a unique opportunity. This spinning top creature probably dates from the earliest phase of life on Earth. It must be over 1 billion years old. The one variety known today is so small you can only see it under a microscope. It's sometimes found in tomato ketchup, or even more rarely in chewing gum. A specimen as big as this may well be the only one in existence." "But we're here to eliminate it," said the captain, shouting to make himself heard above the sound of the storm. "All right, Professor, tell us how to stop that infernal thing." "Your guess is as good as mine," the professor replied. "We scientists have never had a chance to study it." "Very well," said the captain. "We'll try a few shots at it and see what happens." "What a shame," the professor said sadly. "Fancy shooting the sole surviving specimen of a teetotum elasticum." But the anti-friction gun had already been trained on the giant spinning top. "Fire!" ordered the captain. The twin barrels emitted a tongue of flame a mile long. There was no bang, of course, because an anti-friction gun, as everyone knows, bombards its target with proteins. The flaming missiles streaked toward the teetotum, but were caught and deflected. They circled the huge figure a few times, traveling ever faster, ever higher, until they disappeared into the black clouds overhead. "It's no use," Captain Gordon shouted. "We'll simply have to get closer." "We can't, sir," Jim Ironside shouted back. "The engines are already running full ahead, and that's only just enough to keep us from being blown astern." "Any suggestions, Professor?" the captain asked, but Professor Eisenstein merely shrugged. His assistants were equally devoid of ideas. It looked as if the expedition would have to be abandoned as a failure. Just then, someone tugged at the professor's sleeve. It was Momo-san, the beautiful native girl. "Malumba," she said, gesturing gracefully. "Malumba oisitu sono. Erweni samba insaltu lolobindra. Kramuna heu beni beni sadagoa." The professor raised his eyebrows. "Babalu?" he said inquiringly. "Didi maha fenosi intu ge doinen malumba?" The beautiful native girl nodded eagerly. "Dodu umalfa shulamat vavada," she replied. "Oi, oi," said the professor, thoughtfully stroking his chin. "What does she say?" asked the first mate. "She says," explained the professor, "that her tribe has a very ancient song that would send the traveling tornado to sleep, or would if anyone were brave enough to sing it to the creature." "Don't make me laugh," growled Jim Ironside. "Who ever heard of singing a tornado to sleep?" "What do you think, Professor?" asked Sarah. "Is it scientifically feasible?" "One should always try to keep an open mind," said the professor. "Many of these native traditions contain a grain of truth. The teetotum elasticum may be sensitive to certain sonic vibrations. We simply know too little about its mode of existence." "It can't do any harm," the captain said firmly, "so let's give it a try. Tell her to carry on." The professor turned to Momo-san and said, "Malumba didi oisafal huna huna, vavadu?" She nodded and began to sing a most peculiar song. It consisted of a handful of notes, repeated over and over again. "Eni meni alu beni vanatai susurateni." As she sang, she clapped her hands and pranced around in time to the refrain. The tune and the words were so easy to remember that the rest joined in, one after another, until the entire crew was singing, clapping, and cavorting around in time to the music. Nothing could have been more astonishing than to see the professor himself and that old sea dog, Jim Ironside, singing and clapping like children in a playground. And then, lo and behold, the thing they never thought would happen came to pass. The traveling tornado rotated more and more slowly until it came to a stop and began to sink beneath the waves. With a thunderous roar, the sea closed over it. The storm died away, the rain ceased, the sky became blue and cloudless, the waves subsided. The Argo lay motionless on the glittering surface, as if nothing but peace and tranquility had ever reigned there. "Members of the crew," said Captain Gordon, with an appreciative glance at each in turn, "we pulled it off!" The captain never wasted words. They all knew, so they were doubly delighted when he added, "I'm proud of you." "I think it must really have been raining," said the girl who had brought her little sister along. "I'm soaked, that's for sure." She was right. The real storm had broken and moved on, and no one was more surprised than she to find that she had completely forgotten to be scared of the thunder and lightning while sailing aboard the Argo. The children spent some time discussing their adventurous voyage and swapping personal experiences. Then they said goodbye and went home to dry off. The only person slightly dissatisfied with the outcome of the game was the boy who wore glasses. Before leaving, he said to Momo, "I still think it was a shame to sink the teetotum elasticum, just like that. The last surviving specimen of its kind. Imagine! I do wish I could have taken a closer look at it." But on one point they were all agreed. The games they played with Momo were more fun than any others. Chapter 4. Two Special Friends. Even when people have a great many friends, there are always one or two they love best of all, and Momo was no exception. She had two very special friends who came to see her every day and shared what little they had with her. One was young and the other old, and Momo could not have said which of them she loved more. The old one's name was Beppo Road Sweeper. Although he must have had a proper surname, everyone, including Beppo himself, used the nickname that described his job, which was sweeping roads. Beppo lived near the amphitheater, in a homemade shack built of bricks, corrugated iron, and tar paper. He was not much taller than Momo, being an exceptionally small man, and bent-backed into the bargain. He always kept his head cocked to one side. It was big, with a single tuft of white hair on top, and wore a diminutive pair of steel-rimmed spectacles on his nose. Beppo was widely believed to be not quite right in the head. This was because, when asked a question, he would give an amiable smile and say nothing. If, after pondering the question, he felt it needed no answer, he still said nothing. If it did, he would ponder what answer to give. He could take as long as a couple of hours to reply, or even a whole day. By this time, the person who had asked the question would have forgotten what it was, so Beppo's answer seemed peculiar in the extreme. Only Momo was capable of waiting patiently enough to grasp his meaning. She knew that Beppo took as long as he did because he was determined never to say anything untrue. In his opinion, all the world's misfortunes stemmed from the countless untruths both deliberate and unintentional, which people told because of haste or carelessness. Every morning, long before daybreak, Beppo rode his squeaky old bicycle to a big depot in town. There, he and his fellow road sweepers waited in the yard to be issued brooms and pushcarts and told which streets to sweep. Beppo enjoyed these hours before dawn, when the city was still asleep, and he did his work willingly and well. It was a useful job, and he knew it. He swept his allotted streets slowly but steadily, drawing a deep breath before every step, and every stroke of the broom. Step, breathe, sweep. Breathe, step, breathe, sweep. Every so often he would pause a while, staring thoughtfully into the distance, and then he would begin again. Step, breathe, sweep. While progressing in this way, with a dirty street ahead of him and a clean one behind, he often had grand ideas. They were ideas that couldn't easily be put into words, though. Ideas as hard to define as a half-remembered scent or a color seen in a dream. When sitting with Momo after work, he would tell her his grand ideas, and her special way of listening would loosen his tongue and bring the right words to his lips. "You see, Momo," he told her one day, "it's like this. Sometimes, when you've a very long street ahead of you, you think how terribly long it is and feel sure you'll never get it swept." He gazed silently into space before continuing, "And then you start to hurry," he went on. "You work faster and faster, and every time you look up, there seems to be just as much left to sweep as before, and you try even harder, and you panic, and in the end you're out of breath and have to stop, and still the street stretches away in front of you. That's not the way to do it." He pondered a while. Then he said, "You must never think of the whole street at once. Understand? You must only concentrate on the next step, the next breath, the next stroke of the broom, and the next, nothing else." Again he paused for thought before adding, "That way you enjoy your work, which is important, because then you make a good job of it, and that's how it ought to be." There was another long silence. At last he went on, "And all at once, before you know it, you find you've swept the whole street clean, bit by bit. What's more, you aren't out of breath." He nodded to himself. "That's important, too," he concluded. Another time, when he came and sat down beside Momo, she could tell from his silence that he was thinking hard and had something very special to tell her. Suddenly he looked her in the eye and said, "I recognized us." It was a long time before he spoke again. Then he said softly, "It happens sometimes, at midday, when everything's asleep in the heat of the sun. The world goes transparent, like river water, if you know what I mean. You can see the bottom." He nodded and relapsed into silence. Then he said, even more softly, "There are other times, other ages down there on the bottom." He pondered again for a long time, searching for the right words. They seemed to elude him, because he suddenly said, in a perfectly normal tone of voice, "I was sweeping alongside the old city wall today. There are 5 different colored stones in it. They're arranged like this, see?" He drew a big T in the dust with his forefinger, and looked at it with his head on one side. All at once he whispered, "I recognized them. The stones, I mean." After yet another long silence, he went on haltingly, "They're stones from olden times, when the wall was first built. Many hands helped to build the wall, but those stones were put there by 2 particular people. They were meant as a sign, you see. I recognized it." Beppo rubbed his eyes. The next time he spoke, it was with something of an effort. "They looked quite different then, those 2, quite different." His concluding words sounded almost defiant. "I recognized them, though," he said. "They were you and me. I recognized us." People could hardly be blamed for smiling when they heard Beppo road sweepers say such things. Many of them used to tap their heads meaningfully behind his back, but Momo loved him and treasured every word he uttered. Momo's other special friend was not only young, but the exact opposite of Beppo in every respect. A handsome youth with dreamy eyes and an incredible gift of the gab, he was always playing practical jokes and had such a carefree, infectious laugh that people couldn't help joining in. His first name was Girolamo, but everyone called him Guido. Like Beppo, Guido took his surname from his job, though he didn't have a proper job at all. One of his many unofficial activities was showing tourists around the city, so he was universally known as Guido Guide. His sole qualification for the job was a peaked cap, which he promptly clapped on his head whenever any tourists strayed into the neighborhood. Then, wearing his most earnest expression, he would march up and offer to show them the sights. If they were rash enough to accept, Guido let fly. He bombarded his unfortunate listeners with such a multitude of made-up names, dates, and historical events that their heads started spinning. Some of them saw through him and walked off in a huff, but the majority took his tales at face value and dropped a few coins into his cap when he handed it around at the end of a sightseeing tour. Although Guido's neighbors used to chuckle at his flights of fancy, they sometimes looked stern and remarked that it wasn't really right to take money for dreaming up a pack of lies. "I'm only doing what poets do," Guido would argue. "Anyway, my customers get their money's worth, don't they? I give them exactly what they want. Maybe you won't find my stories in any guidebook, but what's the difference? Who knows if the stuff in the guidebooks isn't made up too, only no one remembers anymore. Besides, what do you mean by true and untrue? Who could be sure what happened here 1,000 or 2,000 years ago? Can you?" The others admitted they couldn't. "There you are, then!" Guido cried triumphantly. "How can you call my stories untrue? Things may have happened just the way I said they did, in which case I've been telling the gospel truth." It was hard to counter an argument like that, especially when you were up against a fast talker like Guido. Unfortunately for him, however, not many tourists wanted to see the amphitheater, so he often had to turn his hand to other jobs. When the occasion arose, he would act as park keeper, dog walker, deliverer of love letters, mourner at funerals, witness at weddings, souvenir seller, cat's meat man, and many other things besides. But Guido dreamed of becoming rich and famous someday. He planned to live in a fabulously beautiful mansion set in spacious grounds, to eat off gold plates and sleep between silken sheets. He pictured himself as resplendent in his future fame as a kind of sun, and the rays of that sun already warmed him in his poverty, from afar as it were. "I'll do it, too," he would exclaim when other people scoffed at his dreams. "You mark my words." Quite how he was going to do it, not even he could have told them, for Guido held a low opinion of perseverance and hard work. "What's so clever about working hard?" he said to Momo. "Anyone could get rich quick that way, but who wants to look like the people who have sold themselves body and soul for money's sake? Well, they can count me out. Even if there are times when I don't have the price of a cup of coffee, I'm still me. Guido's still Guido." Although it seemed improbable that two people as dissimilar as Guido Guide and Beppo Roadsweeper, with their different attitudes to life and the world in general, should have become friends, they did. Strangely enough, Beppo was the only person who never chided Guido for his irresponsibility, and just as strangely, fast-talking Guido was the only person who never poked fun at eccentric old Beppo. This, too, may have had something to do with the way Momo listened to them both. None of the three suspected that a shadow was soon to fall, not only across their friendship, but across the entire neighborhood. An ever-growing shadow that was already enfolding the city in its cold, dark embrace. It advanced day by day like an invading army, silently and surreptitiously, meeting no resistance because no one was really aware of it. But who exactly were the invaders? Even old Beppo, who saw much that escaped other people, failed to notice the men in gray, who busily roamed the city in ever-increasing numbers. It wasn't that they were invisible. You simply saw them without noticing them. They had an uncanny knack of making themselves so inconspicuous that you either overlooked them or forgot ever having seen them. The very fact that they had no need to conceal themselves enabled them to go about their business in utter secrecy. Since nobody noticed them, nobody stopped to wonder where they had come from, or indeed were still coming from, for their numbers continued to grow with every passing day. The men in gray drove through the streets in their smart gray limousines, haunted every building, frequented every restaurant. From time to time they would jot something down in their little gray notebooks. They were dressed from head to foot in gray suits, the color of a spider's web. Even their faces were gray. They wore gray bowler hats and smoked small gray cigars, and none of them went anywhere without a steel gray briefcase in his hand. Guido Guide was as unaware as everyone else that several of these men in gray had reconnoitered the amphitheater, busily writing in their notebooks as they did so. Momo alone had caught sight of their shadowy figures peering over the edge of the ruined building. They signaled to each other and put their heads together as if conferring. Although she could hear nothing, Momo suddenly shivered as she had never shivered before. She drew her baggy jacket more tightly around her, but it did no good, because the chill in the air was no ordinary chill. Then the men in gray disappeared. Momo heard no soft but majestic music that night, as she so often did, but the next day life went on as usual. She thought no more about her weird visitors, and it wasn't long before she, too, forgot them.